I want you to close your eyes for a second and just imagine a scenario with me. It's a fantasy, really, something you might dream about.
Okay, I'm with you.
Imagine you have a credit card in your pocket. But this isn't a normal Visa or MasterCard. This is a magic credit card. First off, it has absolutely no spending limit. None.
No limit at all.
Zero. You want a mansion? Swipe. You want a fleet of private jets? Swipe. You want to fund, I don't know, a massive military operation or a sprawling social safety net? Swipe, swipe, swipe.
Sounds like a pretty good deal so far. I think most people would sign up for that immediately.
Oh, it gets better. Here is the kicker. You never actually have to pay off the principal balance, ever.
Never.
You just have to make the minimum monthly payments. And this is the part that, technically defies the laws of physics and economics. To make those minimum payments, you are allowed to go into your basement and just print more money.
So you just create the money to pay the interest out of thin air.
You literally print the cash to pay the interest on the card and the rest of the world. They just nod and accept it. They take your printed paper and they give you real cars, real oil, real electronics, and real labor.
Sounds like a scam. Or, I guess, a dream. But in economic terms, if something sounds that good, it usually means there is a massive hidden cost accumulating somewhere in the background.
Exactly. That magic credit card is a real thing. Economists call it exorbitant privilege. It is the privilege of holding the world reserve currency. It is the position the United States dollar has occupied since the Bretton Woods Agreement. We buy, and the world holds our debt. We consume, and they save.
It's the ultimate free lunch, funded by everyone else.
But today, we're asking the scary question, the one that keeps central bankers up at night. What happens when the bank cancels the card? What happens when the store manager comes out and says, we don't want your points anymore, we want real assets?
That is the multi-trillion-dollar question. And frankly, we usually dance around it in mainstream media. We talk about inflation or interest rates or, quarterly earnings, but we rarely talk about the systemic collapse of that privilege. But today, today we are going there.
We certainly are. We are doing a deep dive into a fascinating, high-energy, and honestly pretty terrifying conversation between journalist Rick Sanchez and the infamous economist Peter Schiff. Now, for the listeners who might not know Peter Schiff, give us the brief bio. Why should we listen to him?
So Peter Schiff is the CEO of EuroPacific Capital. He's known in the finance world as a gold bug, meaning he loves gold and hates fiat currency like the dollar. But his claim to fame, the reason people still pay attention to him despite his contrarian views, is that he was one of the very few people who went on national television in 2006 and 2007 and screamed that the housing market was a bubble and that the banks were insolvent.
And people laughed at him. I've seen the clips.
Yep. They literally laughed in his face on live TV. Panelists, hosts, everyone. They thought he was completely out of his mind. Of course, a year later, they weren't laughing.
Right. He has that I told you so credibility. He saw the iceberg before the Titanic even left the port. But we should also caveat this, right? He is a perma-bear. He almost always thinks the sky is falling.
He does. He's always looking to the crack in the foundation. That's his brand. But in this source material, he isn't just saying the sky is falling. He's describing the specific mechanics of how the sky falls. He's warning about a checkmate scenario involving China, the debt ceiling, and the gold market that he believes is unavoidable.
The checkmate. That's our mission for this deep dive. We need to unpack precisely what moves China is making on the global chessboard. We need to look at this debt iceberg theory he proposes. And we need to understand why he thinks gold is the only lifeboat left.
And just a heads up to the listener, Schiff spares no one in this. He goes after Biden, he goes after Trump, he goes after the Fed. This isn't a partisan rant, it's a systemic indictment.
It's heavy stuff, but necessary. Let's jump right into the deep end then. Part 1, the breaking news. Schiff and Sanchez start their conversation discussing a strategic pivot from China, specifically regarding President Xi Jinping. What is the headline here?
The headline is that China is done waiting. According to Schiff, Xi Jinping is accelerating the timeline to make the Chinese, the RMB, a fully viable global reserve currency that can displace the dollar. He's basically doubling down on it.
Okay, but pause. I feel like I've read headlines saying China challenges the dollar every year for the last decade. It's always coming soon. It's sort of a background hum. Why does Schiff think this time is different? What are the actual mechanisms they are putting in place right now?
That's the key difference he points out. It's not just rhetoric anymore, it's infrastructure. Schiff points to 3 specific accelerators that are happening as we speak. First, they are aggressively ramping up currency swap agreements with other nations.
Explain that for us. What is a currency swap in plain English? Because
Oh.
it sounds like banking jargon.
It's actually pretty simple. Think of it this way. Normally, if Brazil wants to trade with China, say, buy some electronics, they might have to convert Brazilian reals to US dollars first, and then use those dollars to pay the Chinese supplier. The dollar is the middleman,
And the middleman always takes a cut.
always. And it requires both parties to hold dollars in their reserves, which creates this artificial demand. A currency swap allows Brazil and China to say, look, let's just swap reals for yuan directly at a set rate. They cut out the middleman entirely.
Which means less demand for dollars globally. If you don't need dollars to trade with China, why hold so many of them?
Exactly. Every one of those deals, and they're signing more and more, chips away at the dollar's dominance. The second move is even bigger, though. China is launching and expanding something called CIPS. It's a cross-border interbank payment system.
CIPS.
Right. Think of this as a direct competitor to SWIFT.
SWIFT is the messaging system banks use to move money, right? It's the plumbing of the global economy. If you're a bank, you pretty much have to be on it.
It is the plumbing. And crucially, it is plumbing dominated by Western banks and monitored by the United States. If you get kicked off SWIFT, you are financially isolated. We saw this with Iran years ago, and more recently, and much more dramatically, with Russia.
They were just cut off.
Completely.
Uh.
Schiff argues that China and the rest of the world looked at that and said, whoa, we need our own plumbing. They realized that their access to global trade depends on being in the good graces of the U.S. So they're building a system where countries can trade without ever touching a Western bank or asking for U.S. permission.
That's the infrastructure.
Right.
But there was a third point about oil. This one seems to be the linchpin.
The petroleum. This is huge. For 50 years since the Nixon administration, oil has been priced in dollars. It's the bedrock of the dollar's value. If you want energy to run your country, you need dollars. This creates a permanent artificial demand for U.S. currency.
So every country has to hold dollars just to buy oil.
Yes. But China is now the world's biggest oil importer. And they're pushing Saudi Arabia and other Gulf states to settle oil trades in RMB. If the petrodollar becomes the petroleum, even partially, the structural demand for the U.S. dollar collapses. That's a game changer.
That's a massive shift. But Schiff goes further than just competition. He describes a scenario he calls Checkmate. It sounded like he was describing a game of Risk or 4D chess. Walk us through this hypothetical strategy he laid out, because it sounded pretty aggressive.
This is the part that really made me sit up, because it's not just about incremental change. Schiff suggests China has a card up its sleeve that it hasn't played yet. It's a three-step play that could happen very quickly.
Okay, what's step one?
Step one. China announces that the RMB is now backed by gold. Not just, we have a lot of gold in our reserves, but fully convertible.
Yeah.
You can trade your yuan for a set amount of physical gold.
So a return to the gold standard, but only for China, in a world of fiat currencies.
Precisely. They create a clear distinction. They say, the U.S. dollar is backed by debt and promises. Our currency is backed by physical metal. Step two, they make the currency fully convertible on global markets, removing all capital controls.
And step three, he said this was the killer move.
Step three, and this is the killer, is they sever the Hong Kong dollar's peg to the U.S. dollar.
Right now, the Hong Kong dollar is pegged to the U.S. dollar. It moves when we move. It's basically a dollar proxy.
Yes, and Hong Kong is a massive global financial hub. Schiff says they could flip a switch and peg it to the gold-backed RMB instead. If they do that, if they offer the world a gold-backed major currency, trading through a trusted hub like Hong Kong, while the U.S. is offering a debt-backed, inflating currency, Schiff argues the market preference changes overnight.
Money flows to where it is treated best.
Of course. If the yuan protects your purchasing power and the dollar erodes it, the dollar collapses. Not slowly, but maybe in a matter of weeks and months. That is the checkmate.
It frames the currency markets as a confidence game. The dollar has value because we all collectively agree it does. Schiff is saying that agreement is fragile. If a better product hits the market, brand loyalty vanishes.
It vanishes in a heartbeat.
But why would China do this now? Why risk the instability? It seems like a huge gamble.
Schiff argues it's a mix of opportunity and necessity. He says U.S. policies, specifically the weaponization of the dollar and our runaway spending, have given the world an excuse to leave. He says the world is actively looking to divest of dollars. They are tired of holding U.S. debt that loses value every year due to inflation. They just needed a lifeboat. China is building the lifeboat.
And that leads us perfectly into part two, the Achilles heel. Because this isn't just about currency trading or numbers on a screen. Schiff makes the point that most Americans don't realize how much their daily standard of living depends on this privilege.
This is the pill that is hardest to swallow for a lot of people. Schiff argues that the American lifestyle, our ability to consume cheap electronics from Asia, cheap clothes, cheap food from all over the world, is artificial. It's a distortion caused by the reserve currency status.
Artificial how? I mean, we work, we get paid, we go to the store and buy things. That feels pretty real.
It feels real on an individual level, but look at the macro level. The U.S. runs massive trade deficits year after year, decade after decade. We buy way more from the world than we sell to it.
That's the whole twin deficits problem, right? Trade and budget.
Exactly. We also run massive budget deficits. We spend way more than we tax. Now, in a normal country, say Argentina or Turkey, if you did that, your currency would crash and inflation would skyrocket immediately. You'd be forced to stop consuming because you literally couldn't afford imports. Your credit card would be declined.
But because we are the reserve currency, the world lets us get away with it. They keep extending our credit line.
The world subsidizes it. That's the key. They take the dollars we print, and instead of exchanging them for our goods, because we don't produce enough stuff they want, they save them. They buy our treasury bonds. Schiff puts it bluntly. The world vendors us goods and services in exchange for paper IOUs.
And he even makes this claim that this dynamic funds the U.S. military. That was a striking line. He said, we aren't paying for the military, the rest of the world is paying for it.
That's his argument. And it's a powerful one when you think about it. We print money to build aircraft carriers and fighter jets. The inflation that results from that printing is a hidden tax. But it's not just a tax on Americans. It's a tax on everyone holding dollars.
So China, Japan, Saudi Arabia.
All of them. By holding our inflating currency, they are effectively paying a tax to the U.S. to fund the Navy that patrols their shipping lanes. Schiff thinks they are getting very, very tired of paying that tax, especially when that Navy is used to enforce policies they don't agree with.
But wait, I have to play devil's advocate here. You hear this argument from politicians all the time, especially Trump. They say, we hold the cards because we are the customer. China needs us because we buy their stuff. If we stop buying, their economy crashes. Isn't there truth to that?
Schiff absolutely destroys that argument in the transcript. He calls it completely backward, a fundamental misunderstanding of economics. He uses this great analogy. Consumption is the reward for production. It's the prize. It is not the source of economic power.
So in his view, the guy making the TV has the power, not the guy watching it.
Exactly. He says we cannot consume what has not been produced. If the U.S. stops buying, sure, it's a headache for China in the short term. They have to retool. They might have a recession. But they still have the factories. They still have the engineers. They still have the labor. They can just consume their own products or sell them to the emerging middle class in India, Africa, or Southeast Asia.
But if China stops selling to us?
Then we have empty shelves at Walmart. We have empty shelves everywhere. We don't have the factories anymore. We spent 30 years outsourcing them. So if the trade relationship breaks, the producer ends up with the goods and the consumer ends up with worthless paper. Schiff's point is that in a crisis, we need them much more than they need us.
That is a sobering reversal of the customer is king mentality. So let's walk down that dark road. If this consequence of collapse happens, if the global gravy train ends, as he puts it, what does life look like for the average person listening to this deep dive?
It's not pretty. Schiff predicts a massive, painful equilibration. First, prices in America would go through the roof. And he's not talking about the 9% inflation we saw in 2022. He's talking about hyperinflationary pressure as all those trillions of dollars held overseas come flooding back home.
So the dollar's value just plummets.
It plummets. And at the same time, interest rates would soar because there is no one left to buy our debt at 2% or 4%. Why would China or Japan buy our bonds when they're divesting from the dollar?
So mortgages become unaffordable, credit cards become unusable, the whole debt-based economy just freezes up.
It does. And then you get this massive global shift in purchasing power. Suddenly, the things that were cheap for Americans, iPhones, Nike's cars, become prohibitively expensive. And the things that were too expensive for the Chinese or Indian middle-class American real estate, for example, become very affordable. The wealth transfers from the debtor nation, which is us, to the creditor nations.
So our standard of living drops.
It drops to meet our actual level of production, which Schiff argues is much, much lower than our current level of consumption. We've been living in a penthouse on a credit card, and Schiff is saying we're about to be evicted to a studio apartment.
A sobering thought. Now we touched on why the world is angry. Part 3, the catalyst. Schiff identifies a specific turning point where this trend went from a slow burn to an explosion.
The Ukraine war sanctions. This is critical. And again, Schiff isn't debating the morality of the war itself, but he's analyzing the mechanics of the response. When the U.S. and Europe froze Russia's central bank reserves and kicked them out of SWIFT, it sent a shockwave through the global south.
Because it proved that your money isn't really yours if it's held in dollars or euros.
Exactly. It broke the trust. Money is supposed to be a neutral store of value. If you hold dollars, you assume you can spend them. But the U.S. effectively said, if we don't like your foreign policy, we can turn your national wealth to zero instantly with a keystroke. Schiff argues that countries like Saudi Arabia, Brazil, India, even some allies, looked at that and thought, if they can do that to a nuclear power like Russia, they can definitely do it to us. We might be next.
It's the ultimate weaponization of finance, and that accelerated the search for an alternative.
It put the trend on steroids, as he says. It made building that parallel system, that CIPS alternative, an urgent matter of national security for them, not just an economic preference.
Schiff uses a metaphor here about Trump poking a bear. What did he mean by that?
Yeah, he says Trump goes around thinking he's the bear because he's the big customer who can slap tariffs on everyone and demand concessions. Schiff says, no, the producers are the bear. The country that makes your stuff, the country that owns your debt, that's the bear. You don't poke the guy who makes your antibiotics and your steel and also holds your mortgage. It's a fundamental miscalculation of where the power really lies.
But there's another player in this drama that I didn't expect to hear about. Japan. Schiff calls this a critical, immediate threat. Japan is our ally. They're part of the G7. Why are they a danger to the dollar?
This is a bit technical, but it's fascinating, and it's a huge piece of the puzzle. Japan is the largest foreign holder of U.S. debt. They own over $1 trillion in treasuries. They're our biggest creditor.
So they've been financing our deficits for decades.
For decades. But Japan's own economy is in deep trouble. Their currency, the yen, has been crashing relative to other currencies. Their government bond market is incredibly unstable. The Bank of Japan is in a corner. Schiff predicts that Japan will be forced to sell U.S. treasuries.
Not out of malice toward the U.S., but out of desperation to save themselves.
Exactly. To prop up the value of the yen and to stabilize their own bond market, they need cash. Lots of it. Where do they get it? By selling their most liquid foreign asset, U.S. debt. Schiff explains the mechanism. Japan is effectively exporting its inflation to the U.S. When they dump our bonds onto the market, the price of our bonds crashes.
And when bond prices crash, interest rates go up.
They spike. So Japan's problem becomes our problem almost instantly. It's a contagion. If China starts selling for strategic reasons and Japan starts selling for survival reasons, who is left to buy all this debt we need to issue every single month?
The Federal Reserve.
The buyer of last resort. And they buy it by doing the one thing they know how to do, printing more money, which of course creates more inflation, which makes the debt even less attractive to foreign buyers, which makes more people sell.
It is a classic death spiral.
It's a feedback loop from hell. And that brings us to the debt iceberg. I love this term he uses, but the numbers attached to it are just staggering. This is part 4. We usually hear that the national debt is around, what, $35 or $39 trillion now? Schiff says that number is a lie.
Not just an understatement, but a lie.
He calls it a lie of omission. He says that number is just the tip of the iceberg. That $39 trillion is just the official debt held by the public and in intergovernmental holdings. It does not include what are called unfunded liabilities.
Let's define that clearly for everyone. What is an unfunded liability?
It's a promise the government has made to pay you in the future, for which they have set aside zero money today. It's an IOU with no assets to back it up.
So things like Social Security.
Social Security is the big one. Medicare, government pensions for federal workers, veteran benefits, student loan guarantees, FDIC bank insurance. These are all legally binding promises the government has made.
But they aren't counted in that main national debt number. Why not?
This is the crazy part. Schiff makes a great point here. The government uses cash basis accounting. They only count the cash that goes in and out today. If a private corporation like Apple or Ford did this, if they hid all their future pension obligations off the books, the CEO would be arrested for fraud and sent to prison.
There are accounting laws against that for companies.
Yes. GAAP, generally accepted accounting principles, requires companies to list all future liabilities on their balance sheet so investors know the true financial health of the company. The U.S. government simply exempts itself from those rules.
So if we used GAAP accounting, like a real company, what is the real debt number?
The estimates vary, but Schiff suggests it's well over $100 trillion. Some estimates go as high as $200 trillion, depending on how you calculate future healthcare costs and interest. It is an unpayable sum. Completely and utterly unpayable.
This leads to the darkest and honestly the funniest moment in the transcript. The Bernie Madoff comparison.
It's dark humor, for sure. Schiff recalls that Bernie Madoff, the guy who ran the biggest Ponzi scheme in history, once said from prison that the U.S. government is the ultimate Ponzi scheme. And Schiff jokes that Madoff should have been Treasury Secretary.
Because he had the relevant experience.
If you want to know how a criminal thinks, hire a criminal. Schiff's point is that a system like Social Security operates exactly like a Ponzi scheme. You take money from new investors who are current workers to pay off early investors who are current retirees. There is no investment pot. The trust fund is a myth. It's just full of government IOUs. The money is spent the second it comes in.
The only difference is that Madoff ran out of new investors to trick.
Exactly. The government can force new investors, which are taxpayers, to join the scheme. And if there's still a shortfall, they can just print the difference. It's a Ponzi scheme with a printing press, which makes it the most dangerous kind.
So ultimately, Schiff argues the U.S. is insolvent. The debt cannot be repaid through normal means.
It's mathematically impossible. You cannot tax your way out of $200 trillion. So he outlines the only two options left for the U.S. government. Option one, an honest default. You just stand up and say, sorry, we can't pay. Grandma, your Social Security check isn't coming this month. China, your bonds are now worthless wallpaper.
That would cause a global depression instantly. It's political suicide. No president would ever do that.
Right. Never going to happen.
Right.
So Schiff says they will choose option two, inflate it away.
The stealth default.
That's the one. They will print the money to pay every single bill. You will get your Social Security check for $5,000. The bondholders will get their principal and interest back. But that $5,000 will be worthless. A loaf of bread will cost $50. A tank of gas will cost $200. You pay the debt in nominal terms, but you default on its value in real terms.
You get paid, but you can't eat. That is a truly terrifying prospect. Now, before we get labeled as partisans here, we need to address part 5 of this, which is political agnosticism. Listeners might hear this and think, oh, this is just an attack on the Biden administration.
It's absolutely not. Schiff hates everyone in Washington equally on this issue. He criticizes Biden heavily for the sanctions and the Bidenomic spending bills, but he goes right after Trump, too. He explicitly mentions the big, beautiful bill, all that spending under Trump's previous term, plus the tax cuts.
His point is that you can't cut taxes, which is revenue, and not cut spending. That just widens the deficit.
It poured gasoline on the fire. He says Trump ran up the debt faster than his predecessors. And what about this DOGE thing? The Department of Government Efficiency that was supposed to have Elon Musk slash trillions from the budget. There was so much hype about that.
Right. The idea was Musk would come in and clean house.
Schiff calls that BS. He dismisses it completely. He says they ran Elon out of town. His view is that the political machine, the deep state, whatever you want to call it, is too strong. Neither Republicans nor Democrats want to touch the debt because the cuts required would be too painful for voters.
You can't get reelected by telling voters, I'm cutting your benefits by 40%.
Nobody wants to hear that. So they kick the can down the road, and the problem gets exponentially worse. It's a systemic failure of democracy, in his view. The voters want free stuff, the politicians want votes, and the inevitable result is national bankruptcy.
And speaking of government narratives and what's real, Schiff brings up a really specific conspiracy theory, or let's call it a strong suspicion, about the price of gold, the gold drop.
This was fascinating inside baseball. So recently, gold prices were rallying to all-time highs. It was all over the news. Then suddenly, over a very short period, they dropped sharply. Most mainstream analysts just said, oh, it's a market correction, profit-taking. Schiff suspects foul play.
What kind of foul play? Who would be playing?
He thinks the White House, and he implies the incoming Trump administration here, might have orchestrated a short-selling raid on the futures market. Or, alternatively, that they floated a BS balloon narrative about a new potential Fed pick, a guy named Walsh, being a hawk.
A hawk, meaning someone who is tough on inflation and wants to raise interest rates.
Right. If the market thinks higher rates are coming, that's usually bad for gold, so gold sells off. Schiff thinks they might have planted that story specifically to smash the gold price down temporarily.
But why? Why would a president or a president-elect care about the daily price of gold? It seems so niche.
Because in his world, gold is the report card on the economy. A soaring gold price is a vote of no confidence in the president and the currency. It signals that the smart money thinks massive inflation is coming. It's a political embarrassment. Schiff thinks politicians actively work with the big banks to manipulate the gold price to make the economy look more stable than it actually is.
It really highlights how deep his distrust goes. He doesn't believe the CPI numbers, the jobs numbers, or the market movements. He thinks it's all managed perception.
He thinks it's all a show to keep the confidence game going as long as possible.
And if the game is rigged, you need an asset that can't be rigged. Which brings us to part 6, the true money. For Schiff, that is gold and only gold. But we live in 2026. We have millions of people who believe Bitcoin is the new gold. Digital gold. Schiff, he does not agree.
To put it mildly, he goes on an absolute tear against Bitcoin in the source material. He calls it a digital Ponzi scheme and fool's gold.
Ouch. Tell us how he really feels. What are his actual arguments against it?
He argues that Bitcoin violates the fundamental laws of what money is. First, he says it is backed by nothing. It has no intrinsic value. Gold has physical utility. You can use it in electronics, in dentistry, in jewelry, in aerospace. It has 5,000 years of history as a store of value. Bitcoin, in his view, is just digital air that has value because the next person thinks it will have more value, a classic speculative bubble.
But what about the argument that its value is its network, its decentralization?
He dismisses that. He also attacks its utility as a currency, saying that transaction costs are too high and the network is too slow to use for everyday purchases, like buying a cup of coffee. He believes it's failed as a medium of exchange.
But his biggest beef seemed to be with the media, specifically CNBC. He really singles them out.
Yeah, he really went after them. He argues that financial media pumped Bitcoin relentlessly to distract people from the real safe haven, which is gold. He calls the viewers who bought at the top bag holders. He says CNBC hyped it up, brought on all these crypto evangelists, and now regular people are losing their life savings while the early whales, the insiders, all cashed out.
He thinks Bitcoin is a sponge.
A sponge that soaked up the demand that should have gone to gold. He sees it as a giant, high-tech distraction from the real problem and the real solution.
It's interesting. He views the dollar and Bitcoin as surprisingly similar. Both are fiat. Both rely on pure faith with no intrinsic backing. Gold is the only thing anchored in physical reality. But he did mention one exception for crypto, didn't he? Tokenized gold.
Yes, this is where he bridges the gap. He's not against the technology, just the asset. He mentions things like Tether Gold and even his own projects. He admits that blockchain technology is brilliant for moving value quickly and securely across borders. But the token itself must represent title to physical metal.
So the idea is you have the speed of crypto.
You can send $1 million to London in seconds for a tiny fee.
But the value is 100% backed by a bar of gold sitting in a vault in, say, Switzerland or Singapore.
Exactly. It combines the ancient, trusted value of gold with modern digital logistics. That, he says, is the future of money, not Bitcoin.
Okay, we've covered the doom, the gloom, the checkmate, and the Ponzi schemes. Let's try to find some practical takeaways for the listener. Part 7, the investment landscape. Schiff is actually giving advice here. If he thinks the ship is sinking, what does he tell people to do?
His primary directive is clear and unambiguous. Abandon ship. Get out of the U.S. dollar. Do not treat the dollar as a store of value. Don't save in dollars.
And put your money where, exactly?
First and foremost, physical gold and silver. That's his #1 conviction. If the financial system collapses, you want the asset that has no counterparty risk. A gold coin in your hand is not someone else's liability. But he also likes certain types of stocks.
Not U.S. stocks, I'm guessing?
Primarily foreign stocks. Specifically, he likes dividend-paying companies in countries that produce things, countries with strong balance sheets and positive trade balances.
He mentioned emerging markets, and he said something that surprised me. He prefers China to Japan right now for new investment.
He does. He thinks Japanese stocks are overvalued after their recent massive run, and that Chinese stocks have been beaten down so much by negative sentiment that they're a historic bargain. But fundamentally, it goes back to his Global South, or BRICS thesis. He believes these countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and the nations they're aligning with, are the future producers. They have the natural resources, the factories, and the young labor force.
And he made a prediction that China's GDP will exceed the U.S.'s purely on currency realignment without them even growing faster.
Right. It's just math. If the yuan doubles in value relative to the dollar and the dollar halves, suddenly China's economy looks absolutely massive on paper, even if they don't produce one extra widget. It's a mathematical inevitability in his eyes, as the currencies rebalance to reflect economic reality.
There was one last geopolitical point he made about our neighbors, Canada and Mexico, that was pretty chilling.
This was really worrying. He says U.S. policy, particularly trade policy and sanctions, has alienated our closest neighbors. He points out that China is now building deep-water ports in Latin America, specifically in Mexico and Peru. And the purpose of these ports is to bypass the United States entirely.
To bypass us. How so?
Right now, the U.S. is the logistics hub for the Americas. Goods from Asia come into the port of Long Beach and then get railed everywhere. Schiff says they are building a new supply chain that goes directly from South America's resources across the Pacific to Asia's factories and back again. They're cutting the U.S. out of the trade loop.
So if we aren't the consumer of last resort and we aren't the logistics hub,
Then what are we? We're just a big island with a lot of debt. That is the ultimate checkmate he's warning about: economic isolation.
wow. All right, we have covered a massive amount of ground. Let's head to the outro and try to synthesize this. We started with a magic credit card and ended up with geopolitical isolation.
It's a lot to process. It's a very bearish worldview. But I think if we distill Schiff's warning down, there are three key takeaways. Number one, the dollar's reserve status is not a law of physics. It is a privilege, a temporary one, and it is actively being dismantled by our competitors.
Number two, the U.S. economy is more fragile than it looks. We have confused buying power, which comes from our credit card, with actual power, which comes from production. We rely on debt and consumption, while our rivals are building their economies on production and savings.
And number three, according to Schiff, the bill is coming due. The unfunded liabilities are the iceberg we have already hit. The ship is taking on water. It just hasn't fully sunk yet. And in his view, gold is the only real-life vest. Bitcoin, he'd say, is a distraction.
It really challenges that core American exceptionalism narrative, the idea that we assume we will always be on top because we're America. Schiff's point is that markets don't care about your history or your flag, they care about your balance sheet. And our balance sheet is, in his words, a disaster.
A complete disaster.
So, here is a final provocative thought for you to chew on as you go about your day. Schiff said that consuming is just the benefit of producing. It's the prize you get at the end. If the global supply chain China, the global south, decides they can just consume their own products, if they decide they like the prize for themselves, what exactly does the U.S. economy have left to offer the world?
I mean, if we're not making the clothes, and we're not making the electronics, and we're not making the steel, and the credit card gets declined, what do we actually have to trade? What is our product?
And here's the other side of that question. If the checkmate move backing a currency with gold is so obvious to Peter Schiff, why hasn't Xi Jinping done it yet?
That is the big question, isn't it? Are they waiting for the perfect moment of U.S. weakness? Or is there a trap they're afraid of falling into themselves? Because the day the domino falls, if it ever does, the world we know changes overnight.
Something to think about. As always, stay curious, question the narratives you see on the news, and keep diving deep. We'll see you next time.